Okay, so, you sent over a bunch of material about how to deal with, all this economic uncertainty that's going on globally. And I got to say, I was going through it all, and it really hit me that even though we're talking about, like, interest rates and markets going up and down, the real issue here, dealing with a future that we just don't know, well, that feels like something that goes way beyond just the economy,
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting when you take a step back and realize that all this worry about economic uncertainty, it's really just one very specific example of something so much bigger that we all deal with as humans. Like trying to figure out and plan for a future that we just can't completely predict. It's this thread that runs through literally everything we do, think, and feel.
Yeah, totally. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're using all the stuff you sent as kind of our starting point, but we're going to go deeper and explore this really basic part of being human, right? We're going to talk about how this not knowing what's going to happen shapes every single thing, from how we talk to each other every day to the huge, fundamental ideas we have about time itself. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. Let's start by looking at how widespread this whole thing of facing an unknown future really is. If we think about it from like an AI perspective, you touched on this in your stuff about predictive modeling, this isn't just about one specific group of people or one place in the world. It's a universal thing. It affects every single person, no matter who they are, how old they are, or what's happening in their life right now. We all live with a future that, well, haven't happened yet.
Right. And you even see this reflected in those economic reports you sent. Like words like assessment and planning, if you really break them down, aren't they all about trying to guess what's going to happen next, even though we can't really know for sure? It's like we're always running these what-if scenarios in our heads about the future.
Exactly. And to connect that back to the bigger picture, think about the simplest examples, like a baby cries.
Yeah.
Right. They're anticipating that they'll be comforted or fed. It's a future need. An older person thinks back on their life, all those past unknowns that have shaped who they are now. We're constantly aware of this future that's unfolding, even when we don't really realize it. It's the background of our entire lives.
It's almost like we're making these little bets all the time on what's going to happen next. And this is so clear when you think about, relationships, right? Every single connection, every bond we make is built on a path forward that's uncertain. Will this friendship get stronger? Where will this relationship go? Those economic papers you shared about consumer confidence actually show this indirectly because those feelings are often tied to what people expect about their future security within those relationships.
That's a really interesting point you bring up. How does something like, this big economic uncertainty that's affecting everyone impact those relationships, which are already uncertain on their own? You see hints of this in the stuff you sent about how financial stress can make existing tensions worse and even change how families and communities function. Those shared anxieties about the future, or even just disagreeing about how worried to be, it can really put a strain on those connections.
Oh, for sure. And this goes beyond just our personal lives, right? Think about personal growth, like learning something new, figuring out who you are. Those are both journeys with an uncertain destination. You don't know exactly who you'll become when you decide to go after a new passion, for instance.
What's fascinating is how that connects to something really practical, mentioned in the economic guide you sent over, skills retraining initiatives. When you think about economic changes and how the job market is constantly shifting, which is exactly the kind of instability your sources are talking about, this idea of retraining is all about getting ready for a future career that we can't really picture yet. It's not just about teaching people new skills, but also about giving them the ability to adapt to whatever jobs might exist in the future, even ones we haven't even thought of yet.
And when you zoom out even further, you can see how our whole society is built on this need to handle things we don't know about. Governments, legal systems, even cultural traditions, they're all frameworks that we've come up with to try to create some order and predictability in a world that's inherently unpredictable.
It struck me how even the language in your economic sources, like talking about stability and predictive models, shows this deep desire we all have for a future that's more certain, like we want to feel secure.
Exactly. And that economic guide is a great example of this happening on a big scale. It's basically a set of strategies, a possible plan of action, all meant to make the unpredictable nature of the global economy a little less, unpredictable. It's humanity's way of trying to build a stronger foundation, even though things are always changing around us.
Okay, here's where things start to get really fascinating for me. How this whole uncertainty thing affects our perception of time. It's such a basic part of being human, but we rarely think about it this way. You're so right. The way we each experience time is so deeply connected to how we think about what's coming next. When the future feels sort of stable and predictable, time can feel like it's flowing in a straight line at a constant pace. But when there's a lot of uncertainty, especially if it feels threatening, our perception of time can get really messed up. Time can feel like it's stretching out forever because of anxiety, or it can rush by in a blur of worrying and trying to get things done. Psychologists have studied this a lot, and they found that stress and uncertainty can really warp how we feel time passing.
So is it possible that the economic guide, by trying to give some direction and a sense of control, is also kind of trying to stabilize that perception of time? Like if it can reduce the anxiety we feel about the economic future, maybe it can make time feel a little less, I don't know, chaotic and overwhelming.
That's a great connection you're making. By offering a potential path forward, even if we don't know the exact details of that path, it can potentially ease some of that underlying anxiety. It can create a story about the future that feels less scary and more manageable, which can actually change how we experience time in the present.
It's wild to think about history this way, too. We usually see history as just a bunch of events that already happened, the past that we know. But really, every single one of those moments was once an unknown future, right? All the historical analyses you sent about past economic crises and how things recovered, they're basically stories about how past uncertainties played out.
Exactly. History is basically the study of all those past uncertainties that we now know about, and how we understand those past unknowns, the struggles, the new ideas, the big changes in society that shapes what we expect from the future, and yeah, even our anxieties about it. When that economic guide uses recent observations and looks at what happened before, it's using that record of past economic ups and downs to try and help us make better decisions today.
So this drive we have to try to predict and control the future, it's a powerful force in human history, right? I mean, think about the agricultural revolution, humans figuring out farming. That was all about making the food supply more reliable, trying to create a future where communities were more secure. And then we have the rise of science and technology.
What's so interesting is how these huge leaps forward were driven by this basic human desire to reduce uncertainty and gain more control over our environment and our lives. But on the flip side, when you look at history, those times of major economic instability have always been triggers for huge societal shifts like mass migrations, revolutions, even changing borders. Those economic reports you shared, they fit right into this pattern of humans struggling with economic unknowns and trying to find solutions.
It almost makes you look at basic human emotions like fear and hope in a new light. They're not just random feelings. They seem like deep-seated mechanisms that we've developed over time to help us deal with this uncertainty, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. Our biology, even our thought processes, they've evolved to help us anticipate and react to whatever might be coming next. Fear is like our alarm system, warning us about potential dangers in the unknown future, while hope keeps us motivated to chase opportunities and fight for a better tomorrow. Even curiosity, that human need to explore and learn, it plays a part in reducing uncertainty by helping us gather information about what we don't know. When you look at that economic guide and its emphasis on building resilience, that's a direct recognition of this need we have to adapt and survive future challenges, a need that's built right into us.
And isn't it interesting how our own personal view of the future changes as we go through life? A little kid's world is all about what's happening right now, but someone older might think way further ahead, maybe focusing on what they'll leave behind. Economic uncertainty probably affects different stages of life in completely different ways.
Absolutely. Someone just starting out in their career might be mostly worried about keeping their job and having financial security over the long term. But someone nearing retirement might be more focused on whether their savings are safe and how economic changes could affect their retirement income. Economic uncertainty impacts us differently depending on how far ahead we tend to think and what stage of life we're in. Understanding those different viewpoints is crucial for creating policies that actually work, which is something your sources probably get into.
So this idea of an unknown future, it's amazing how it pops up as a central theme in so many different fields, like philosophy, for instance. They've been wrestling with this for centuries.
Oh, absolutely. The very nature of time, the whole debate about free will versus destiny, these are big philosophical questions that are deeply connected to how we experience a future that hasn't happened yet. Existentialism, that branch of philosophy you mentioned, tackles this head on. It confronts that anxiety of making choices when we know the future is basically wide open and uncertain. And even something as practical as an economic forecast, it's trying to deal with that same existential uncertainty, but in the world of finance, trying to map out what might happen, but knowing they can't be sure.
Then you have physics, with that really interesting idea, the arrow of time. It's
Yeah,
a different kind of concept than our everyday experience of the future, but there does seem to be a parallel there, right?
definitely. Even though many of the fundamental laws in physics seem to work the same forwards and backwards in time at a really basic level, our everyday experience is that time flows in one direction, past to present to future. And this lines up with our gut feeling that the future is still undecided while the past is fixed. Even in economics, their models often assume things move in one direction, that what happened before affects what will happen in the future. But exactly how much influence the past has is still uncertain and up for debate, which your sources probably illustrate.
And math gives us tools to try to measure this uncertainty, right? With things like probability and statistics. These are the building blocks of so much of economic forecasting and risk assessment.
You got it. Probability and statistical models give us ways to analyze and make predictions about future events that are uncertain. Economic forecasting, managing risk in financial markets. These fields lean heavily on these mathematical tools to try and make sense of what might happen next. And they try to figure out how likely different outcomes are, which means they're constantly dealing with the unknown future.
You also mentioned logic playing a role, something called temporal logic. That sounds really interesting in the context of making plans for the future.
Yeah, temporal logic is basically a system for thinking about statements that involve time in a very structured, logical way. Think of statements like, inflation will go down next quarter, or the market has always gone through cycles of growth and contraction. When we make economic plans or try to understand future scenarios based on past data, we're often using this kind of temporal reasoning without even realizing it. We're trying to find logical connections between different points in time.
Okay, so with all this uncertainty around us all the time, it's no surprise that it affects how we feel so much. We've talked about anxiety, but there's a whole range of emotions it triggers, right?
Absolutely. Uncertainty can bring up so many different emotions, from anxiety and fear to hope and even excitement, depending on what we think might happen and how we each tend to react. And our own biases, those mental shortcuts we all use, they play a big role in how we think about the unknown. For example, optimism bias might cause us to underestimate potential economic risks, while negativity bias could make us overly pessimistic about the future, and those biases can affect our financial decisions in ways your sources probably explore.
And it's fascinating how belief systems often help us navigate all this uncertainty. Religion and spirituality, they often offer ways to understand and deal with the big unknowns in life.
Yeah, lots of belief systems provide stories, rituals, and structures for understanding the unknown. They can offer comfort and meaning when we're faced with uncertainty. Ideas like fate, destiny, or beliefs about what happens after we die can help us make sense of things that are outside our control. And it's interesting to think that even secular approaches like the economic guide you shared, with its focus on planning and working together, can offer a kind of secular faith in our ability to create a more predictable and successful future.
Let's bring this down to a more practical level. How does all this navigating the unknown actually affect individuals and their communities in their everyday lives?
On a personal level, it really shapes the choices we make, our behaviors, and ultimately our overall well-being. If we feel like there's a lot of uncertainty, it can lead to more stress, make us less willing to take risks, and just make us feel overwhelmed in general. But on the other hand, if we can cultivate a sense of agency and control, even when things are uncertain, it can build resilience and make us feel more motivated. And as your economic guide probably emphasizes in its policy recommendations, giving people information, education, and resources is key to helping them feel that sense of control, which is so important.
And it's not just about how individuals react, right? The way one person or a group responds to uncertainty can ripple outward, affecting the whole community. We see this in economic downturns, for example. Fear can spread like wildfire, changing how people act as a group.
You're exactly right. Fear and anxiety can be contagious within a community. But on the flip side, when people come together to tackle shared uncertainties, like economic hardship, it can foster incredible solidarity and cooperation. The economic guide's focus on social cohesion and regional cooperation highlights how interconnected we are and how powerful it can be to work together to face those shared uncertainties.
So how does the world on a larger scale usually react to all this uncertainty? Are there common patterns we see emerging across different societies and throughout history?
Yeah, throughout history, humans have come up with different ways to manage uncertainty on a bigger scale. Think about things like insurance. That's a way of pooling resources to protect individuals against risks, against those unknown future events. International treaties and agreements are another example, countries working together to address shared global uncertainties, whether it's about the environment, politics, or, yes, the economy. And as we've been talking about, your economic guide is a modern-day example of this human urge to create systems and plans to navigate the inherent unpredictability of the future.
And with all these efforts to predict and control, there are some pretty big things to consider, right? Especially when we're talking about something as fundamental as a stable economy and how it affects people's lives.
Absolutely. When we make decisions today, knowing that there's a lot of uncertainty, we have to think about the potential consequences down the line. Things like promoting sustainable economic practices, which your source probably addresses as part of long-term stability, are all about taking responsibility for the future generations. And similarly, when times are tough economically, questions about distributing resources fairly and making sure vulnerable populations have support becomes super important, which you see reflected in the guide's discussion of social safety nets.
Okay, so if we accept that dealing with the unknown is just a part of being human, are there ways we can get better at it, both individually and as a society? What are some practical steps we can take?
I think improving education and encouraging critical thinking are crucial. When people are equipped to analyze information objectively, weigh potential risks and rewards, and make informed choices even when things are ambiguous, they're much better prepared to navigate an uncertain future. Promoting psychological well-being and making sure there are strong social support networks can also build resilience, both for individuals and communities, and help us cope with the anxiety that uncertainty often brings. And as the economic guide strongly suggests, making policies based on evidence and having strong international cooperation are essential for effectively addressing those big global uncertainties that affect us all.
You mentioned some abstract logical conclusions earlier from like an AI perspective. Could you talk about those in the context of everything we've been discussing?
Of course. If we start with the idea that the future is inherently uncertain, and humans are beings who anticipate and react emotionally to that uncertainty, then we can logically conclude a few things. First, the more uncertainty people feel, the more likely they are to experience anxiety and stress, both individually and as a society. Second, anything that demonstrably reduces that perceived uncertainty, like personal planning, transparent communication from institutions, or clear national economic strategies, can theoretically lead to less anxiety and a greater sense of control. And finally, because so many of the big uncertainties we face are shared challenges, collective action and collaborative strategies are generally more effective at dealing with those uncertainties than individuals trying to go it alone. This last point really highlights why so many of the recommendations in your economic sources stress the importance of working together.
All right, let's wrap this up. It's pretty amazing how what started as a look at global economic uncertainty turned into this exploration of the much broader, universal human experience of dealing with the unknown.
I agree. By getting a deeper grasp of this fundamental part of being human, we can approach specific challenges like economic instability in a much richer and more nuanced way. It goes beyond just numbers and policies to recognizing the human element at play, our inherent need to find our way in a world that we can't completely predict.
This has been a really insightful conversation, and it leaves me with a final thought for you, our listener. As you go about your day, think about how this need to navigate an uncertain future influences your own choices and feelings, even in areas that have nothing to do with economics. Which of the effects we discussed today, whether it's on your relationships, your perception of time, how you approach personal growth, or how you rely on societal structures, which one of those resonates most with your own experiences? It's a powerful way to look at our lives. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
This is DigitView.